Senator Cormann, the Minister, earlier today you talked about the need to get, in terms of the future submarines, the best value for money. I think words to that effect.
Yeah. Well, what I said is that the government's objective is to procure the best possible submarines for the best possible defence and national security outcomes at the best possible price, and subject to these objectives that we want to maximise Australian industry involvement in the project. And of course the responsibility for managing that procurement project rests with the Department for Defence.
Sure. Can you just help clarify one thing? I think we've traversed this previously in estimates, particularly in the issue of procurement. When the government considers the issue of best possible price, does it take into account the analysis of bodies such as the Royal United Services Institute of the UK, which has been around since 1831, which is undertaking studies that local defence procurement in that country carries with it significant benefits in terms of tax receipts, in terms of the multiplier effect and the like. So it could be that, for instance, buying a submarine from overseas might be, say, 10% more expensive. I'm not saying that it would be, but we would miss out on it as a nation significantly in terms of tax receipts, the jobs impact, the multiplier effect on the economy. So when best possible price is considered, what do you mean by that? Does it take into account the impact on our local economy?
Well, again, I mean, you're asking me a question that goes to a process that is the responsibility of the Department of Defence.
No, I'm sorry, this goes to issues of procurement.
Well, the procurement, exactly, the procurement of the next generation.
No, procurement generally, please.
Well, if you have questions in relation to procurement generally outside of defence procurement, I'm happy to.
So you're saying that defence procurement. So when you consider, it's a pretty straightforward question. When the government considers the issue of best possible price for the future submarines, or indeed more generally for other, this is the biggest Commonwealth procurement, one of the biggest Commonwealth procurement projects I think ever. Yeah. But when it considers the issue of best possible price, as you put it, does that include the issues of the social and economic impact of building something locally, the receipts that the government will receive in tax, state governments will receive in payroll tax, for instance, and the obvious multiplier effect on the economy of having a local industry with thousands of Australians being employed for that project?
Well, I mean, again, I mean,
you obviously,
well, yes. No. What I'll say to you is that the procurement of complex and national security sensitive defence assets is not the same as the procurement for stationery or office supplies. Or there's obviously a different process when you assess the merit of or relative strengths and weaknesses of various options in terms of procurement. And this process, consistent with the way this process was run under the previous government, for example, in the context of the procurement of helicopters, I believe is entirely consistent with the way it was managed then. Now, really, I mean, there are all sorts of factors that are taken into account, of course, when the ultimate decision is being made. But this procurement is very much a procurement process that is managed by Defence on behalf of the government, and ultimately the decision, of course, will be made through the appropriate fora of the government.
But Minister, when considering the issue of best possible price, to use your words, will the government, in respect to the submarines, take into account the economic benefits of a local build, of having a significant local content of at least 70%, as was the Collins-class submarines, in terms of tax receipts to the Commonwealth, tax receipts to the states, having thousands of Australians employed on the project, and the enormous multiplier impacts it has on the local economy?
Well, let me put it to you this way. Obviously, the ultimate decision, after a competitive evaluation process that is managed by the defence portfolio. This decision ultimately will come before the National Security Committee, and it will typically involve ministers, obviously from the Prime Minister down, the Treasurer, the Defence Minister, the Minister for Industry, myself as the Finance Minister, and of course all sorts of factors are taken into account. But fundamentally and ultimately, what will drive our decision is obtaining for Australia the best possible submarines for the best possible defence and national security outcome at the best possible price, and subject to these objectives to maximise Australian industry involvement. Now, I mean, that is pretty self-explanatory in terms of what it is that we're trying to achieve. Right now, we're going through a process to assist us in making an informed decision, drawing on the most appropriate information and advice at the end of that process.
Minister, perhaps I haven't put the question, framed it appropriately for you. Can I put it to you in these terms? All other things being equal, the other factors that you referred to in terms of the strategic or national security imperatives, if those matters were equal and that we could get the same submarine with the same capability built here compared to in another country, but there might be a slight price differential between Australia, if it's slightly higher, I'm not saying would be, slightly higher in Australia than in another country, on the face of it, the overseas submarine would be cheaper. But would the government take into account the significant tax receipts you would receive from having something built locally, the tax receipts of state governments in terms of payroll and other taxes, the added-on economic benefits and the multiplier impacts of having thousands of Australians employed on such a project, including the supply chain effects in terms of those that would support that, and also as simple as the local snack bar and supermarket that would have more customers by virtue of having more people employed.
I understand the question you're asking. I understand the argument you're making. The reason I can't be more helpful is because my only involvement in this process is as the shareholder minister for ASC, which is one of the participants in the process.
I'm not. Price.
But no, but I can't. I'm not running the competitive evaluation process. I've been as helpful as I can be in explaining the government's overarching policy objective. The process to ensure that we achieve that objective is being managed by the defence portfolio, and of course, my only involvement in this process is as the shareholder minister for ISC. So these are not issues that I can
please help
accurately
me, Minister.
assist you with.
Please help me on this, Minister. Does the government take into account the economic impact of having a local build in terms of the tax receipts, the jobs created, the multiplier effect of the economy? Will that be taken into account?
And what I've said to you is that the government will be taking many different factors into account, and that is why we've got a variety of portfolio ministers around the table when the decision is made. Ultimately, though, we want to maximise Australian industry involvement in a way that still ensures that we get the best possible submarines at the lowest possible price, and in a way that delivers the best possible defence outcomes for Australia.
Senator Xenophon, it may assist that later on in the schedule at 2.5 we're dealing with procurement services.
But this is about this particular project that the Minister has distinguished from other performance procurement.
Indeed.
Which I'm not running the procurement for.
And indeed, so the Minister, we're not getting anywhere with this.
Okay.
You're not getting the answers that you want, and the Minister is not at liberty, clearly, to say any more. So I'm suggesting that maybe it should be applied to two